In this video, we will discuss Elaine Showalter's influential essay Towards a Feminist Poetics. This essay presents Showalter's analysis of feminist criticism from different standpoints. In the introduction, Showalter says, feminist literary theory should not appease critics but should be formulated independently. The absence of a unified and clearly articulated theory leaves feminist criticism vulnerable to attacks and leads to disagreements among feminist critics themselves. Many abstract theories in literature have been based solely on male perspectives, experiences, and choices. This distorts the social and personal context in which literature is created and consumed. Women's fiction often satirizes the precise and systematizing male figure, particularly when it comes to women as subjects. These male characters, like Casaubon in George Eliot's work or Mr. Ramsay in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, are critiqued for their self deception, their claim to objectivity, and their use of emotion disguised as reason. Some radical feminists argue that methodology itself is an intellectual tool of patriarchy. It imposes implicit boundaries on what can be questioned and discussed. They see the demand for theory as a threat to the authenticity feminists seek, believing that feminist analysis has been co opted by academia and that the movement should resist assimilation. While male critics have taken center stage and engaged in open contestation with writers, women have often confined to roles such as translators, editors, and interpreters. Celebrating the anonymous and patient work done for the advancement of women's participation, as Virginia Woolf urged in her essay, can be seen as a necessity rather than a virtue. Feminist criticism can be categorized into two distinct types. The first type focuses on woman as reader. It examines how the hypothesis of a female reader changes our understanding of a text and reveals its sexual codes. This kind of analysis Showalter refers to as feminist critique. It is grounded in historical inquiry and seeks to uncover the ideological assumptions within literary works. It explores various topics such as the portrayal of women in literature, the biases and misconceptions in literary criticism, and the gaps in male dominated literary history. It also delves into the exploitation and manipulation of the female audience, especially in popular culture and film, as well as the analysis of women as signs in semiotic systems. The second type of feminist criticism is concerned with woman as a writer. It focuses on women as producers of textual meaning. It explores the history, themes, genres, and structures of literature created by women. This branch of criticism delves into the psychodynamics of female creativity, the challenges of developing a female language within linguistics, the trajectory of individual or collective female literary careers, literary history, and in depth studies of specific women writers and their works. Showalter terms this discourse as gynocriticism. The feminist critique, rooted in Marxist sociology and aesthetics, is fundamentally political and polemical in nature. It aims to expose and criticize the societal sins and errors of the past regarding women. On the other hand, gynocriticism is more experimental and self contained, engaging with various modes of new feminist research. The feminist critique can be compared to the Old Testament, which focuses on uncovering past wrongs, and gynocriticism can be compared to the New Testament seeking the grace of imagination. A feminist critique of Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge reveals the distortions caused by male critics' fantasies and interpretations. The male critics, including Ewing Ho, misread the relationship between Michael and Susan Hencard in the novel. The passive role attributed to Susan is a result of patriarchal constraints, and she cannot actively shape her own destiny. What the male critics overlook is that Hencard not only sells his wife but also his daughter, emphasizing the symbolic act of selling his entire share in the world of women. Hardy intentionally emphasizes the sale of the daughter to highlight the patriarchal society's commodification of daughters. Hencard chooses to live within the male community, defining his relationships based on paternity, money, and legal contracts. His tragedy lies in realizing the inadequacy of his system and his yearning to regain the loving bonds he has lost. The emotional core of the novel revolves around Hencard's appreciation of his wife's daughter, Elizabeth Jane. Unlike the other female characters, Elizabeth Jane is guided by her own heart rather than societal laws. Hencard himself teaches her to value legality, paternity, and external definitions, causing her to eventually reject him. In Hencard's alleged weakness and moments of tenderness, Hardy reveals the man at his best. Consequently, the female characters in the novel and Hardy's other novels can be seen as idealized and melancholic projections of a repressed male self. This analysis highlights one of the challenges of feminist critique, its male orientation. By focusing on stereotypes of women, the sexism of male critics, and the limited roles of women in literary history, we only learn about what men have thought women should be rather than understanding women's actual experiences and feelings. Showalter calls for an extensive engagement with male theorists like Althusser, Barthes, Macrae, and Lacan, and the application of their theories to male texts and films. This investment in a male centric framework can create resistance to questioning its limitations and historical context. Moreover, there is a tendency within feminist critique to naturalize women's victimization, making it the central and obsessive topic of discussion. Some works even make moral distinctions between women merely betrayed by men and those who make careers out of betrayal, potentially celebrating the opportunities of victimization. This approach comes dangerously close to the seductive celebration of victimization, betraying the critical perspective of feminism. In contrast to the focus on male literature, Gynocritics aims to establish a female framework for analyzing women's literature. It seeks to develop new models based on the study of female experience rather than adapting existing male models and theories. Gynocritics diverges from the linear absolutes of male literary history, abandoning attempts to fit women within the lines of the male tradition. Instead, it directs attention to the newly visible world of female culture. Gynocriticism is aligned with feminist research in disciplines such as history, anthropology, psychology, and sociology. These fields have developed propositions about a female subculture encompassing ascribed status, internalized constructs of femininity, occupations, interactions, and women's consciousness. Anthropologists, for example, study the relationships between women as mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends, as well as aspects of sexuality, reproduction, body image, initiation rites, purification ceremonies, myths, and taboos. Michelle Rosaldo notes that the symbolic and social conceptions that seem to separate and restrict women can also be the basis for female solidarity and self worth. When men live separately from women, they inadvertently provide women with symbols and social resources on which to build their own society. In women's literature, feminine values can permeate and challenge masculine systems that contain them. Women have imaginatively engaged with myths of Amazons and fantasies of a separate female society across various genres, from Victorian poetry to contemporary science fiction. Gynocritics must consider the diverse trajectories and complexities of political, social, and personal histories in shaping women's literary choices and careers. Virginia Woolf, in her 1929 essay, Women and Fiction, emphasized the importance of allowing for elasticity in the study of women writers, acknowledging that their work has been influenced by conditions unrelated to art. To illustrate the necessity of this comprehensive approach, we can examine the case of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her verse novel Aurora Leigh. In the introduction to the women's press edition of Aurora Leigh, Cora Kaplan defines Barrett Browning's feminism as romantic and bourgeois, centered on the transformative power of love, art, and Christian charity. Kaplan explores Barrett Browning's engagement with artists, radicals, and female predecessors of her time. However, she overlooks the pervasive influence of Robert Browning, the male poet, on Barrett Browning's work during the 1850s. Understanding how susceptible women writers have historically been to the aesthetic standards and values of the male tradition, as well as male approval and validation, allows us to appreciate the complexities within artistic marriages. Such unions often involve internal conflicts, self effacement, and ultimately the marginalization of women's voices, except in exceptional cases where the husband assumes a supportive rather than competitive role. Barrett Browning's letters from the 1850s reveal the painful struggle between her love and ambition for her husband and her commitment to her own work. There is a sense in which she desires him to be the better artist. At the start of the decade, she was more famous than him, but as time went on, she noted his increasing recognition while her own work faced challenges. Without an understanding of the framework of the female subculture, we risk missing or misinterpreting the themes and structures of women's literature and failing to establish necessary connections within the tradition. Florence Nightingale's metaphors in her 1852 essay Cassandra anticipated not only her own medical career but also the experiences of heroines in women's novels of the 19th and 20th centuries. The awakening from the drugged, pleasant sleep of Victorian womanhood, depicted in fiction, often leads to agonizing realizations. Dame Rebecca West suggests that unhappiness remains a key element in contemporary fiction by English women. Female protagonists' stories are often marked by compromise, madness, and death. Although the reclamation of suffering is the beginning, its purpose is to discover the new world. Adrienne Rich, one of the voices of this new women's writing, challenges the alienation and rejection of motherhood that daughters have learned under patriarchal systems. Many works of the 1970s delve into the quest for the mother, going beyond the fear of becoming one's mother and exploring a sustained search for maternal connections. These purposeful awakenings and mythologies of female culture provide feminist criticism with its most challenging, inspiring, and relevant task. Feminist readers have consistently believed that women's unique experiences, would shape distinctive forms of art. In the 19th century, this contribution was viewed ambivalently. Victorian reviewers such as G.H. Lewis, Richard Hutton, and Richard Simpson focused on the educational, experimental, and biological challenges faced by some women novelists. Many women themselves conceptualized their situation in these terms. Some reviewers recognized women's sympathy, sentiment, and powers of observation, suggesting that the novel would provide an appropriate outlet for female emotion and fantasy. In the United States, novelist Fanny Fern saw women's access to the novel as a form of repressive desublimation, a harmless channel for frustrations and desires that could otherwise pose a threat to family, church, and state. Fern recommended writing as therapy, a means of escaping the stifling silence of the drawing room and rebelling against the indifference and insensitivity of men. Fern's perspective, conveyed through her scribbling woman, sought to indirectly provoke masculine response, aiming to shock rather than please. At the turn of the century, members of the Women Writers' Suffrage League began exploring the psychological bondage of women's literature and its ties to a male dominated publishing industry. Elizabeth Robbins, the League's first president and a novelist and actress, argued that no woman writer had truly been free to explore female consciousness. She contended that women writers felt compelled to echo old fables and present puppets pleasing to a male governed world. The popular impression was contrary to reality. The woman novelist or journalist rarely dared to express her true thoughts in print. In those fields, she had to wear an aspect that would most likely please her male peers, given that her publishers were not women. 19th century women began organizing their own publishing houses, such as Emily Faithfull's Victoria Press in the 1870s and suffrage presses emerged at the beginning of the 20th century, aiming to combat the inhibiting commercial monopoly. The Women Writers' Suffrage League firmly believed that once women overthrew male domination, the unexplored territory of the female psyche would find unique literary expression. Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, argued that economic independence was the essential prerequisite for autonomous women's art. Like George Eliot before her, Woolf believed that women's literature held the promise of a precious speciality, a distinctively female vision. Showalter outlines the three developmental phases in the female tradition. The first phase is the feminine phase. During the feminine phase, spanning roughly from 1840 to 1880, women writers aimed to match the intellectual achievements of male dominated culture while internalizing its assumptions about female nature. This period is categorized by the use of male pseudonyms, which originated in England in the 1840s and became a prevalent practice among English women writers. In addition to the well known names we recognize, such as George Eliot and the Bronte sisters writing as Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, many other women also adopted male pseudonyms to navigate the double standards imposed on their literary work. The use of these masculine disguises extended beyond the title page and exerted an irregular influence on the narrative, affecting the tone, language, structure, and the character development. In contrast to the English counterparts, American women writers of the same period often chose overtly feminine pseudonyms such as Fanny Fern, Grace Greenwood, and Fanny Forrester. Behind these seemingly delicate names, they conceal their boundless energy, strong economic motives, and remarkable professional skills. It is noteworthy to find occasional English women who employed both strategies, creating the illusion of male authorship while incorporating a domestic message of femininity into the chosen pen names. An example of this is Harriet Parr, who wrote under the pseudonym Home Lee. The feminist content within feminine literature of this era is typically subtle, indirect, ironic, and subversive. One must read between the lines and discern the missed possibilities within the text to fully grasp its feminist implications. The second phase is the feminist phase, which unfolded from approximately 1880 to 1920, coinciding with the attainment of women's suffrage. Women gained historical empowerment that allowed them to reject the traditional expectations of femininity. Literature became a platform for female writers to vividly portray the ordeals and injustices experienced by women. Elizabeth Gaskell, Frances Trollope, among other feminine novelists, initially expressed a personal sense of injustice within their works, often focusing on themes of class struggle and the hardships faced by factory workers. As the 1880s rolled in, a new generation of women, known as the New Women, emerged and redefined the role of women artists, emphasizing their responsibility to support and advocate for their fellow suffering sisters. In the 1890s, the pinnacle of this phase was represented by the emergence of Amazon utopias, imaginative depictions of utopian societies where women were at the center, set in either futuristic England or America. These works served as both fantastical visions and strong protests against male dominated governance, laws, and medicine. One notable author of Amazon Utopias was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, an American writer who not only delved into these idealized female societies but also analyzed the preoccupations of masculine literature, particularly concerning themes of sex and war. Gilman explored alternative possibilities for an emancipated feminist literature. In her works, she took George Eliot's concept of women's precious speciality to its matriarchal extremes. Gilman's utopian feminism can be seen as a form of feminist socialist realism taken to its most forceful expression. However, it is important to note that women novelists of this period, including Gilman, in her short stories were not confined to didactic formulas or exclusively maternal topics. They ventured beyond such limitations, showcasing their range and diversity of themes and styles. The third phase is the female phase, which has been unfolding since 1920. Women writers in this phase reject both imitation and protest as forms of dependency. Instead, they turn to female experience as the wellspring of an autonomous art, extending feminist analysis to encompass the forms and techniques of literature. Notable figures representing the formal female aesthetic, such as Dorothy Richardson and Virginia Woolf, begin to conceptualize the idea of male and female sentences, dividing their work into masculine journalism and feminine fiction. Through this division, they redefine and imbue external and internal experiences with a sexualized lens. Their literary experiments are characterized by both enriching and confining aspects as they delve deep into the celebration of consciousness. Even in Woolf's renowned definition of life as a luminous halo, a semi transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end, there exists an underlying metaphor of withdrawal and containment reminiscent of the uterus. In this sense, Woolf's concept of a room of one's own becomes a metaphorical Amazon utopia, a space populated by women where they can freely explore and create their own narratives and experiences. Showalter concludes her essay with a section on feminist criticism, Marxism, and structuralism. In attempting to address these complex permutations of the female tradition, feminist criticism has employed various theoretical approaches. The most natural direction for feminist criticism has been the revision and subversion of related ideologies, particularly Marxist aesthetics and structuralism. This involves altering their vocabularies and methods to incorporate the variable of gender. However, Showalter believes that this adaptation is ultimately unsatisfactory. Feminist criticism cannot continue to rely on ill fitting hand me downs from men, akin to Annie Hall in the realm of English studies. Instead, it must emancipate itself from the influence of accepted models and be guided by its own impulses, as John Stuart Mill advocated for women's literature in 1869. This is not to deny the necessity of utilizing the terminology and techniques. However, when we consider the historical conditions in which critical ideologies are produced, we realized why feminist adaptations seem to have reached a standstill. Marxism and structuralism both position themselves as privileged critical discourses and claim superior positions in the hierarchy of critical approaches. Science is a key word in both systems as they assert themselves as scientific approaches to literature, rejecting personal, fallible, interpretive readings. Marxist aesthetics presents a science of the text, in which the author becomes the producer of a text whose components are historically and economically determined. Structuralism offers linguistically based models of textual permutations and combinations, offering a science of literary meaning and grammar of a genre. Despite the existence of feminist criticism written by women, attempts at synthesizing feminism, Marxism, and structuralism have so far been unsuccessful. While scientific criticism strives to purge itself of subjectivity, feminist criticism embraces the authority of experience. However, the experience of women can easily disappear or become mute, invalid, and invisible when lost in the diagrams of structuralism or the class conflict of Marxism. Experience is not mere emotion, and we must challenge the equation of the feminine with the irrational, as protested in the 19th century. However, we must also recognize that the questions we need to ask extend beyond what science can answer. Before we can locate the feminine not said, we must seek the repressed messages of women in history, anthropology, psychology, and within women themselves. Only then women can probe the fissures of the female text and move beyond the current theoretical impasse in feminist criticism. This impasse is not solely a problem of precise definitions and suitable terminology or theorizing amid struggle. It stems from the divided consciousness of women and the split within women themselves. As scholars, women are both daughters of the male tradition and the sisters in a new women's movement. Women are torn between the rational, marginal, and grateful role expected of them within the male tradition and the awareness of the commitment demanded by the women's movement. It is tempting to remain critics and teachers of male literature, anthropologists of male culture, and psychologists of male literary response, claiming universality. Showalter concludes the essay by saying that the task of feminist critics is to find a new language and a new way of reading that can integrate women's intelligence and experience, reason and suffering, skepticism and vision. This endeavor should not be confined to women alone. Critics, poets, and scholars of all genders can join women. One thing is certain: feminist criticism is not a passing visit. It is here to stay, and women must make it a permanent home.